we are running a little late, so I'm going to move very quickly, like a fast-flowing river, to our first session. Shafiqul Islam is the chair of the session, and I'm going to just give you a short introduction for him. We have coffee and tea set in the back. Maybe we'll skip the break, so whenever you like, skip in for a little coffee or tea. But Shafiqul Islam is Professor of Civil and Environmental Engineering at Tufts University School of Engineering. He's Professor of Water Diplomacy at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, where he directs the Water Diplomacy Program. He's a pioneer in water diplomacy, and his work focuses on water governance, climate challenges, and engineering diplomacy. He has authored more than 100 peer-reviewed articles and 5 books, including Water Diplomacy, a Negotiated Approach to Managing Complex Water Networks, which is actually a book that is highly praised in multiple multinational as well as local civil society organizations. He's currently developing an engineering diplomacy framework to address complex societal and global challenges. He very kindly accepted our invitation to chair this panel. Shafiq is also a Radcliffe Fellow this year, so he has come the very large 1.5 mile distance from Tufts to Harvard. Shafiq, welcome.
Thank you, Hitesh, for such a generous introduction. Yeah, although 1.5 miles, it took me over an hour really to come from home. So home is also not very far. So I got stuck. So anyway, so yeah, this year I'm here at Harvard, really not very far from here at Barley Hall. This was probably the best intellectual feast I have ever had. I think it's an eclectic set of about 50 fellows from all over the world. Okay, what about now? It's better? All right, so let me come a little bit. Okay, so this is about 50 people from all over the world, and I am probably the second one of engineering type. The other one is, he's a musician, teaches at MIT. So not really pure engineers. So other 48 are really all over, basically from musician to novel writer to anthropologist, and you can basically see anything in between. So anyway, so good morning. And thank you for joining us, those of us here, as well as I know many of are also joining through the internet and other media. So let us begin with this something that living with rivers, yes, I think as Diana was saying, the river is everything in South Asia. So I will not go there, I think I'll go a little bit into this. But before I do that, I think what I would like you to do, maybe imagine a situation really. See, you are in South Asia, and although living here in Cambridge and looking at Charles River versus the Ganges, we cannot even imagine what those are. But at least for now, as a thought experiment or an imagination, so close your eyes and think about basically your family, and you are a South Asian in a particular part of close to a river, and you hear a very basically noisy sound of water at night. And in the morning when you woke up and you found that the river has shifted part of your land and part of your home. Not flooded, shifted. It's gone. And this is not new. This has been going on for several thousand years. That's the way even Bangladesh was created, basically through the deposition from Himalayas. So think about really living with rivers in South Asia is not a metaphor. It is real. So what has changed? So what has changed, what we are trying to do today here is that over the last 100 years, things have changed. So how did it change? So river used to basically, we used to live with rivers, now also we do. Over the last 100 years, we tried to manage the river. So managing the river and living the rivers are two different things. So we want to basically acknowledge that first. So what has happened really, if you just think about last 100 years, 100 years ago in the South Asian region, if you think about it, we are about 300 million people. Right now it's about 2,100 million, so 2.1 billion. 7-fold increase in just number of people. Now, if you take the most basically optimistic or the pessimistic scenario of the changed climate, in South Asia, on an average, there may be about 0.7 degree change in temperature from different global climate models, and there are uncertainty, but somewhere between, say, 0.5 to 1 degree centigrade change in temperature, compared to 7-fold increase in population. You can do the same thing with GDP, it's probably more than 7-fold. So just those two metrics alone creates a serious pressure really on the water system. Then the question is basically, how do we manage the water? Do we manage or do we leave? And what does it mean? So to bring that to perspective, that I will go back to Torun's basically very sharp observations. So he told me to read his book, The Billionaire Entrepreneur. So one observation he made there, I think, was quite good. I think he was saying that when we came here, we did not tell you really when we came. I think we came about the same time to this country. At that time, it was almost impossible, or almost unthinkable that someone from India or Bangladesh can create a $1 billion company. You have to be either in New York or in London. You could not have done it. Now you can. That has fundamentally changed the dynamics really what we can do really even in South Asia with rivers. So meaning that it's not just world is getting more connected and then we are globalized and so on. Yes, those are true, but at the same time, the transfer of information and knowledge is almost at the speed of light now. And what I'm seeing right now and talking here, I'm sure people from Bangladesh are also listening real time. That speed can be also transferred really to what we do with water or with river. And how do we do this? That's the challenge. So I'm very fortunate that because I got involved very late, so I did not know really what the panel was. So 2 weeks ago, I talked to Toru and said, look, we are doing this, can you help? I said, fine, I will do whatever you're trying to do, see if some way I can help what we are trying to do, at least motivate some direction. So both of us share at least one thing, I think, in common, if not anything else, is that it's not only creating more knowledge. We want to create knowledge those are actionable for some desirable outcomes. So how do we do this? So for that really, so I did talk to our panel, and these are very distinguished set of panel from Harsh to basically Navida and Maira, and coming from very different angles. So I thought we would organize the panel in a way that is a little bit more tangible. So what does that mean? So I'm trying to focus on 3 different things. And Diana already basically, I don't know, I did not plant her, but she did it anyway. So she was coming from a humanist angle. So that I call feeling. So how does thinking, feeling, and doing come together? Because we can think a lot of stuff, and we do. And as scientists and engineers, we have a lot of thinking about things, how to manage water, how to manage rivers. That's the thinking part. Feeling part comes in really, so how do I feel about the water really? How do I feel about the river? Is river a stakeholder? As Diana was saying, that can fish be a stakeholder? If they are, what is their skin in the game? You can only be a stakeholder if you have a skin in the game. So whose skin is in the game really right now here? Who is representing the river? Then comes the doing part. We can think about it, we can feel about it, but thinking and feeling is nice. We feel good about this, but actually what do we do with this then? And can I bring all 3 together into something that to solve some problems? And that is the way we are thinking that basically the panel would basically work on this. So we will start with Harsh, and he has a tremendous degree of experience really in actually thinking part with the systems view of the world and the World Bank. And he graduated from here, so I knew him for many years, and he was basically one of the last few, maybe if not the last, maybe almost the last part of Harvard's water program. So for those of you who do not know really, Harvard was basically much ahead of their game in 60s in water. They are the one who created the Harvard water program. That created this whole genre of really bringing in engineering and economics into the mix. Nothing else. It was not basically that interdisciplinary at that time, but at that time, you have to think about this is in 60s. So it used to be called the Harvard Blue Book. The Harvard Blue Book essentially created Harvard Water Program, and Peter Rogers and others were very instrumental in that, and Harsh is one of the graduates from that program. Unfortunately, that program is not there anymore. So this would be another challenge basically Harvard can take on, that basically should we revive the water program here? Or if we do really, how could it be, and what would be the nature of this? Because that, I think, is very unfortunate that it just disappeared. Yeah, so we took it over. So we are here at Tufts, really, and then we are trying to work with people at Harvard and MIT. So we are working on this idea that we are calling water diplomacy. What is this? So you can think of this as an evolution of really the Harvard water program that only try to do water as an economic good. We are saying that no, water is an economic good is fine. That was in 60s. In 2025, it is much more than an economic good. Now we have to talk about cultural aspect of water. We have to talk about the spiritual aspect of water. We have to talk about is fish more important than the farmer, and so on. So this is where essentially what we want to do really is to see how this thinking, feeling, and doing can come together. So with that, really, so let me just give I don't have to give much introduction about Harsh. So Harsh graduated from here many years ago, and he has been, I think, working at the World Bank for over 30 years, and with all kinds of very intricate, complex water problems. You have heard about suspending the Indus Water Treaty. You also seen that what happened in 2024 in Bangladesh, India flood. That flood was not from the major rivers. It happened in a place that there was no flood for last 50 years. These were very small rivers, Feni River and Gomati River, very small. Compared to Ganges, Brahmaputra, and Meghna, they probably run less than 10% of the water. But it created a serious flood in 2024, just after the uprising in Bangladesh, and it created another set of problems with India and Bangladesh, because Bangladesh thought basically India is trying to punish them, although there is no scientifically verifiable truth to this. It was really a natural calamity, which you can attribute now to changing climate. Perhaps it was. But perhaps it was not, because in the last 2 years it did not happen. So when a particular river will essentially dominate really the dynamics of this is almost impossible to predict. So what has to be happening really, then we need to prepare really for things that would come, but exactly when we do not know. So that's where I think maybe Harsh could be very powerful in terms of telling us few things that what have we learned really over the last 30 years, particularly with the focus in South Asia and with its experience with the World Bank. Yes, climate is changing. How are we adapting to this, and what can we do to take it one step further? And maybe once he's done, then I'll go with the second panelist, so, and then introduce the second panelist at that time. Harsh, so it's all yours.
Okay, thank you very much, and it's a pleasure to be back here after a really long time. So thank you again for the opportunity. What I'll try to do in the next few minutes is to just give a flavor of some of these issues that we are talking about. Hopefully not only about the thinking, but also something that I feel very strongly about, and also what we've been doing about it as well. What I'll try to do in the next few minutes is to give a flavor of how we can think about these kinds of issues and how technology could play a role in terms of us reimagining the way we work with rivers and their systems. So again, my name is Harsh, and I work at the Global Environment Department at the bank, and had the privilege of getting a degree here in Environment and Water Resources Systems Engineering 30-something years ago. So what we are trying to do, especially at the World Bank with our new mandate, which is not just on poverty alleviation, but to also look at it on a livable planet, is to explore a lot of these things which come in the way of making the planet livable. So either in terms of natural resources degradation, there's some 2 billion hectares of land that's degraded right now, and you have a lot of our rivers, a lot of the waters, the oceans, all degrading in many different ways. Some because of many issues of the pressures that are placed on them. Some because of issues of pollution, where there's land, water, air pollution of different types that's changing the way we can interface with these rivers and what use can be made of those. Along with a lot of climate risks, both historical climate risks that are continuing, but also climate change related risks, which completely change the way in which we have to think about a lot of these kind of issues. But the challenge we always have is what Rumi in the 13th century talked about in terms of an elephant in the dark room, right? Where everyone looks at a different part of the elephant and sees a different thing or feels a different thing when you do the thinking about the feeling, right? So then you get a very different angle on the types of problems that you think you're dealing with by looking at it in a very narrow way. And that's the same in a river basin, that if we look at it, some people look only at the waters, the blue water as it's called sometimes. Some people look at climate issues and say, I'm the rainfall expert, I only do this, I only do evapotranspiration, I only do this, and so on. And also some people look at different aspects of the basin, looking at only agriculture, or only water, or only forests, and so on. And one of the challenges is that we develop institutions to manage each of these little bits and pieces as well, which don't necessarily all talk to each other as well in these areas. And that's the big challenge that we have, that if you have deforestation upstream, you may then result in, let's say, more sediment coming downstream and affecting dams. And I have an interesting relationship with dams in the sense of, since I have both an environmental and a civil engineering background, the civil engineer part of me loves a good dam. The environment part of me is not that sure. So it's interesting to try and think about these, and you begin to realize that there are no such things as really good dams and really bad dams. It's a matter of how you conceive of them, how you fill them, how you operate them, and how you use them in different ways. And, but the thing is, you also notice that everything is linked with everything else in here. So that's one of the issues about even the new program you're starting. It'll be good if you can look at the rivers, but in the larger spatial context in which they are, because that's what really affects all of these different aspects of rivers. And lots of people need to work together. So that's why it's good that we were hearing from you and Hitesh about looking at not just the engineering aspects, but looking at other aspects. And we'll come back to that in a second. So that way we can hopefully appreciate the beast in all of its glory and see what is to be done. The thing that's also changing today is that we have new types of technologies at our disposal, which we didn't have just a few years ago. For example, this world of disruptive tech, we've tried to categorize into 3 groups. One is things that disrupt the data value chain. Data value chain being how you go from data to information to knowledge to actually supporting decisions relating to either planning or real-time operations, right? And there are new ways to now collect data from Earth observation, from sensors on the ground, being able to analyze them in new ways with a lot of cloud computing and so on, and help make decision support tools to help make those decisions easier. You also have, in addition to the software part of things, you have a lot of hardware changes that are happening as well, which are things such as doing 3D printing or automation, robotics, trying to do advanced materials, energy tech, environmental tech, and so on. There's a lot of these that are changing every day, which we all can leverage for the work that we are doing. And the last is less about technology, more about platforms. How do stakeholders interact with each other? Like we are joined by online people today. How do we share ideas? How do we share money? How do we share kind of systems that we are working on in a more useful way? And how do we learn better? Because every job that we do right now is going to be obsolete soon. So how do we keep evolving and learning new skills all the time in there? Leveraging technology in that process as well. So with all of these technologies, I'll just focus on the first one a lot, on the data side of things, because that's very crucial for the work on rivers. When we go to different countries in the world, we usually hear, we're in the middle of nowhere, of course we have no data, anything. Or when we go to my country, India, you always say, of course we have lots of data. But it looks like it's mostly the termites that are digesting this information and not people, right? And we have the new normal right now where people are drowning in data, and how do you drink from the deluge becomes the challenge in this thing. And that's the new normal that we have. And in terms of where this stuff comes from, it usually comes from sensors on the ground. And each of these photos has a story. Like, I mean, that one I think was one of the first weather radar that we had done in Ethiopia. The second last is one of the first real-time sensors on the Ganges River that we had financed in the bank and so on. And there are lots of ways in which these manual methods can be made a bit more automatic over time as well that you can look at. Maybe I should come back sometime to this story behind this one. Okay. Then we also have a lot of Earth observation from satellites. There's about a few thousand satellites out there now, with many of them are remote sensing, some communication, some remote sensing. And they expect to be 100,000 satellites by the end of this decade, right? So it's going to be really crowded up there in terms of satellite space. But it's also great because everyone can see the Earth with new kinds of sensors, looking at new wavelengths and so on, and come up with all kinds of new ways to think about how to manage forests better or water resources better anywhere in the world. But these can then be paired also with the data that's rescued from the termites, as well as generated by different models which are out there, so that anybody, anywhere with any digital device could be able to get the data that they need to help make the decision they want, whether it is do I need an umbrella today, or do I need to open the gates of this dam, or what do I grow on my thing in the next season in my farm, and so on. So this is where a lot of these are completely disrupting, with all these buzzwords of disruptive technology, the things that we do. But the thing that's disrupting these, and it's giving us insights in completely new ways. We now have ways in which we can look at every corner of the Earth. For example, that's my favorite one, the CO2 one, where it's a NASA visualization based on their OCO2 satellites and models and so on, where you can see the forest breathing every day, because forests also give off CO2 during the night and take in during the day. Or every forest fire that was there in this season in Canada, for example, you can go in and look at these. Or every, for example, as you go around the world, every coal-fired power plant in India and China and other things, to be able to see the CO2. So there's a lot of these kinds of things now you can see from space, including for water resources. That's completely changing the way you think about it, with especially some of these new satellites like SWAT and so on that have gone up. Now, what's also changing is the way you visualize a lot of this information. So it used to be that everything was in the form of tables and reports and so on. But now today you can take all this complex data when you're drowning in it and try to make it in a way in which you can visualize it with interactive maps, graphs, 2D, 3D, or 4D, as we call it, 3D animated, or VR, AR, interactive graphics, and so on. And this has completely changed the way you interact with information and use it for your own work, right? We started with using it for things like Google Maps and so on, but now it's for every sector. Everyone's using these kinds of tools. But what's disrupting even the disruptive tech is AI nowadays, right? And depending on who you ask, either it's the best thing since sliced bread, it can solve all our problems going ahead, or some people refer to it as more and think about all the risks that are involved with this as well, to try and think about all the things that need to be managed in terms of using AI effectively. And both are true, because you do need to manage what's on the right side, but to try and take advantage of what's on the left side, to be able to fill in data gaps, get projections, get new insights into things that you thought you knew, and so on, and pulling it together. So there's a lot of these that really, this is the future way in which we'll be interacting with all kinds of data. In the bank, we've been trying to pull a lot of this stuff together into something we're calling the Livable Planet Observatory. And there's a lot of platforms, and you'll have the presentation, so you can also click on these links if you want. There's also a couple of mobile apps and so on, to go explore a lot of this new wonderful world of data that we have at our disposal for any part of the world, right? And so that's a useful thing to look at. And finally, the issue is on the South Asia side. There's been a lot that's been written, and unfortunately not very well known, about the types of issues on things like water quality and other things, because access to data is particularly poor. When I was studying in India in Madras IIT, where we had in civil engineering, all my water resources classes were done with data from the Colorado River here, because all the India data was secret, which is a stupid way to use academia. So the thing is, now after 3 generations of hydrology programs that we've been supporting in India, finally there's the data reasonably in the public domain. Still could be improved in terms of formats and so on. But the same is true in terms of making and using a lot of the data. This is, for example, all the pollution control board, Central Pollution Control Board data on things like what Diana was talking about yesterday, like BOD, which parts of India seem pretty bad, or fecal coliforms, which is my favorite, where in any other part of the world, if the way you measure it is you say, take 100 cc of water, put it on a agar paper, see how many colonies grow, fecal coliform colonies. And if it's 1 in 100 cc thing, they say, boil your water, do this, do that. In Delhi, by the time the Yamuna comes into Delhi, it's around 6,000 or so. And by the time it leaves Delhi, the numbers could be anywhere from 1 to 25 million, right, in the thing. So the numbers are off the charts compared to most other parts of the world. And there's a lot that's required in terms of doing this, but it's not in terms of what they normally do, which is the dilution things. It's more in terms of trying to make sure that things are treated. And the reason is, this is my last slide, is to look at, there's a lot of lessons we can learn from Harvard itself, right? So for example, this is the birthplace of environmental engineering, right, in the world. So we had this Gordon Fair, who set up, in those days, they called it sanitary engineering, wastewater engineering, different names, but later became known as environmental engineering. And so he wrote the first book on wastewater treatment and environmental engineering. And it had on its first cover page the quote which said, I think Peter Rogers showed it to me, and it said, the solution to pollution is not dilution, right? Like, and so that's the whole aim that they were trying to do. But even there, they were trying to look at entire river basins. So then his grad students, I mean, there's Fair, Gare, and Oken, this became the textbook for this for the longest time in there. Then, as we heard from Shafiq, in the mid-50s, 55, they had started a program called the Harvard Water Program to try and bring in multidisciplinary aspects into this. So this was a request from the Bureau of Reclamation, Corps of Engineers, those kind of folks. And they wanted to say, look, how do we decide this is a good project, bad project? You can't look just at the engineering aspects. So then they got together economists, and it was led by a social scientist, the whole program, so Arthur Maass. And he came up with this thing called Design of Water Resources Systems, which then became Blue Book and other things as well for the Corps, and other folks. And there were many spin-offs after that. So for example, Robert Dorfman, who worked on the program, he was the economist who was on Peter's thesis committee as well when he did his PhD in the thing. And so I had the pleasure of working with him on the Middle East, Israel, Jordan, Palestine stuff, and great prof. So he would come in and say, that you can find in chapter 4 of my book, which I wrote with my 2 graduate students. And 2 graduate students would be Samuelson and Solow, 2 Nobel Prize winners. Thing. So really, that was the first book on environmental economics in the world, right? So that was a whole other set of things that I did. He and his wife edited many journal articles later on that as well. People like Fearing, who was on the end of the Harvard Water Program, he was on my committee ages ago till he passed away. So there was, and his advisor, Thomas. So they had invented something called the Thomas Fearing model to try and do stochastic water systems to try and understand those better, to create synthetic stream flows and so on. And that became the way that everyone did modeling for water resources. They said, look, history doesn't always repeat itself, but something like history will repeat itself. So they started using the statistical properties of history to create many future scenarios so that you could say, okay, what do we do in terms of these kinds of systems? And they came up with really interesting things. But things are changing now because climate is changing and there's a lot of issues around it. So in fact, people are now saying exactly what you were saying, which is, should we be resurrecting the Harvard Water Program type things, as well as there's been a nice article by another of Roger's students with a lot of others on things such as looking at the concept of systems analysis, because through a lot of this work, this whole Maass et al. Book created the concept of water resources systems, right? So there's been a lot of work that Harvard's been doing in this area, and it'll be great to try and see what can be done in terms of pulling this together and try to actually solve issues in South Asia, to go from the thinking and feeling to actually doing something about it. So thanks.
All right. So thank you, Harsh. So this was, yeah, really, you have very successfully combined thinking, feeling, and doing, and more on thinking part. So what can be done, I think, is, so let's go through this cycle, and then we will come back how to put this together. So our next panelist is Maira. She is at the University of Notre Dame and anthropologist by training, but has done a lot of work in terms of feeling aspects of water. So what we discussed really, maybe she will bring us some of the things that we heard really. Yes, I think there are lots of data being available. If you think about 100 years ago, really, we were collecting data from rain gauges or stream flow gauges. Now we are looking from satellites. So there is an illusion, again, with my student that basically satellite will basically solve our data problem. And they actually think that satellite actually measure rainfall. And those of you do not know, it doesn't measure rainfall. Even the best satellite, probably what it is doing really, it is measuring cloud top temperature, and from there it is inferring what the rainfall will be. And those are also not really very easily available at the scale that we're interested in. If I'm a farmer in Bangladesh with 1 hectare of land, what information really at 10-kilometer scale will give me? So how am I going to use that information really, although it's available? That creates a problem, and that problem, I think, is not going to go away. So we need to create knowledge, those are actionable at the scale that those are important. These are not multinational companies that have hundreds of thousands of acres. These are the people who are small landholders. How is that particular information from NASA that is available, free, online, going to be helpful? And where does the filling part comes in then? But Maira is going to tell us, okay, so I've heard about that. There are a lot of thinking going on, a lot of things are available. Now, when we actually do it, and then how do I feel about this? And whose water are we talking about? For whom are we creating this knowledge? And that is where I think Diana's humanist angle comes in. So this group, I would consider that these are humanist. And many of us are. We are not really just thinker, humanist, or doer. We are a very strange combination of this. So what I'm hoping to do, the next generation, really, if we want to resurrect Harvard Water Program, maybe not the way it was initially conceived, really, as engineering and economics. And that has been basically now dated, because water is not only an economic good. We can look at water as an economic good, and we can come up with the most brilliant solutions. But actually, it's not getting implemented, because if I am the marginalized community, I do not really care really whether you're making money as a multinational company, and you are. And I know it, and I am really helpless. So how do my voice really comes into the picture? Because most of the people are basically from that community. Few people and the few organizations are controlling this, essentially the global, whether you call it water or data flow or whatever we want to call this. So few people are making decisions that is affecting millions others. So there where I think the humanists are extremely powerful, but they are also not in a place that they can combine the thinking and the doing part. They feel very bad, and I think genuinely feeling bad. Feeling bad is the first step then. What do we do with this? So with that, I'll basically hand it over to Maira. She will be joining us really remotely with us, but she could not be here. So Maira, it's all yours.
Hi, everyone. Very happy to be a part of this conversation. Thank you for inviting me. Thank you to the organizers for making sure this proceeded so smoothly. If you can't hear me at any point, let me know somehow. I'm sure I'll hear you. I have 5 different monitors open in front of me right now. I'm actually not at home. I'm at my sister's place. And so I was not given access to her screens. And so I'm trying to make do with mine. What I want to do today is think with prompts/questions that Shafiq proposed, and that the panel agreed to be in conversation over. And I'll touch on each one of those 3 very, very briefly. And I'm hoping that there will be threads here that can make for interesting conversation, towards the end. I'm hoping my slides are visible. What you should see right now is the first slide, which is a view of the Indus Basin, and it's basically meant to give you some idea of its transboundary nature. So I first want to make clear where I'm thinking from. I've been doing this research since around 2014 and have primarily worked with one irrigation department, and this happens to be one of the world's largest, in fact. The department also manages one of the world's largest contiguous irrigation infrastructure networks, and this is the Punjab Irrigation Department, headquartered in Lahore. which is the capital city of Pakistan's Punjab province. It's its most populous province, also its agricultural center. So what the department manages is infrastructure of the Indus Basin. And I'm pausing here because Shafiq has put so much emphasis on managing, and I'm happy to, like open this up later. Also, managing it's not a straightforward term. So what you see here is the Indus Basin. It spans more than 60% of Pakistan's territory. But here on the second slide is how my interlocutors, primarily those staffing the irrigation department, and this includes engineers as well as non-engineering bureaucrats. So this slide shows how they conceive of this system. And so for the longest time, once I began research with the department, trying to understand Pakistan's water worlds, trying to understand the government of water, this is the figure, this is the diagrammatic representation that I was coming across in every office, in every meeting. And this show one of the reasons that I show this is I show this because when I was first invited to be a part of the panel, my instinct, and this has long been an instinct, my instinct was to be like, oh, but actually I don't really work with rivers. I don't actually work on rivers. Should I be a part of this, conversation? And I've had that question jostle around in my head for a very long time now. And I do think that it can be a generative question for all of us. And that's why, I'm sort of launching into this longish story. And the reason is that I think that the ease of this answer, do I work with rivers? Do I not work? Who works with rivers? What does it mean to work, with or on rivers? I think that the ease of that answer unravels if we stay with the depiction that I'm showing in this slide and then start asking other sorts of questions, right? And so for me personally, the question has been, why am I more comfortable describing my work as an anthropology of water project, not really an anthropology of rivers project? What is more abstract or what is more concrete? Is that water, or is that, is that a river? And I think here also, of course, metaphors start to give way. What does it mean to talk more concretely about water? And what my fieldwork looked like in Pakistan's mostly, I would say mostly rural Punjab in Pakistan, my fieldwork basically and largely took me to sites such as these. I come back to this depiction, bear with me, but to give you an idea of why I felt like I was distant or removed from the river was, here is a branch of a canal. Here are water courses with lids on them, and this is how water is being distributed from one landholding to the next. So there is a lot of measurement, there was a lot of concrete, there's a lot of engineering, there's a lot of very minute micro management. People speak in terms of this or that drain, this or that, branch canal, this or that link canal. And what I was missing here was the recognition, and the recognition, which I think also raises this question of where the river ends. Do we see this infrastructural network as extensions of the river? Of course, there is engineering language which describes this network in particular ways, right? So, for example, if you look at this depiction, you'll see. Sorry, I'm trying to remove my video so I can see the slide. Okay. So you see here that there's a lot of diversions, and that's something that engineering has accomplished. That's something that politics, international diplomacy has resulted in. This kind of, what you see here, this kind of engineering, very intricate engineering network here is the result of, or is a manifestation of, very charged politics, very charged national politics in India and Pakistan, very charged geopolitics. And so, just to give you one idea of what I'm talking about and how easy it is to take for granted certain things, to take for granted their status is settled and as things and as straightforward. If I can draw your attention to the dotted line um, on the top right of this diagram, that dotted line is how my engineering interlocutors, it's how their systems show the Pakistan-India border. And for the longest time, I didn't pay attention to the dotted line. I was like, yes, of course, as the Indus Water Treaty happened, I don't want to talk more about the Indus Water Treaty because everybody's always trying to explain the treaty to me. That's how I began my fieldwork. And I'm not interested in the treaty. I understand that moment in history really well. I'm so bored. I'm doing an everyday water management, everyday water governance project. That's that. And it took me a while to actually start paying attention to this dotted line and, to start thinking about the work that this dotted line was doing. And so I'm not going to, delve into this much more here, but like one of the arguments I'm trying to make in my book is about how dam infrastructure in Pakistan has a bordering function, and this to me is in conversation with, but distinct from the more typical view of understanding rivers perhaps as borders, or understanding rivers as crisscrossing borders and not respecting borders. And what going through the archives um, of diplomacy, of international law, of arbitration, what it has led me to argue or show or think is that um, much of this network that you're seeing on the slide, much of this engineering infrastructure um, has a bordering function. It had a bordering function, and here I'm in conversation with a specific, with there's a ton of work here, really good, very rich work here. One of the scholars specifically I'm in conversation with and helped by is the historian Wazira Zamindar, who has posited a long partition between India and Pakistan. There's a tendency to think of 1947 as a moment, and she's instead encouraged thinking about a long partition. So what I'm trying to understand this infrastructure as, specifically these large dams such as Tarbila and Mangla, as borders, as attempts at making a border when the border was a forever breached one, because it is a shared one, because these rivers are in fact shared rivers. And then what I want to give you a sense of is, yes. And so again, here the point is very simply to show the nested nature of this infrastructure. So if you look at the part of this representation that's numbered 3, I would say, like a past self would say, most of my work was done at the field level. When the waters, traversed the rivers, it's gone through canals, link canals, main canals, distributaries, and now it's finally through the outlet in the field, and that's the politics I'm interested in. And that was much of what my research focused on. But what's to say that this is not, in fact, a question of how we are living, with rivers. Moving on to the second prompt. The second prompt is actually a really interesting one. Gave me the longest, pause in a good way. It was something like it went something like, how do cultural values and everyday realities of rivers conflict with formal management approaches? Again, this is a question that I've long thought about. In particular, I think as an anthropologist. Because there's an expectation, and this certainly was something that I had to fight against. There's an expectation that a lot of the thinking and feeling work happened outside the circles of formal management and formal government. And instead, what I ended up looking at was, and trying to understand more and more, was the kinds of feelings that are at play in the everyday work of formal water management, of water, governance. Whether we're talking about how Indian and Pakistani counterparts meet annually, or once a year, twice a year, once in several years, or whether it's about how, for example, um, irrigation officials interact and trust or distrust the information relayed to them by their counterparts with whom they share nationality, but not riparian status and provincial status. And so here specifically, I'm talking about tensions within Pakistan between the upper riparian province of Punjab and the lower riparian province of Sindh, and how the extent of distrust is such that even though there is technology like gauges at certain points, a certain flow has to be recorded at certain gauges. One way towards bettering relations and enhancing trust, or like working towards trust building, is positioning actual people to read those gauges. Whereas technically those gauges don't need to be read. The readings are there. And so again, I think this raises interesting questions of data, the automaticity of data, how far that can go, where it can take us, where it like begins to flounder. Another point I want to make here, and I'm concluding. I know I don't have too much time left. Is while I haven't gone in depth into the latest round of arbitration between India and Pakistan over the Indus Water Treaty, many of you would know that Pakistan and India have actually been in court. And when I say in court, I mean the international. I mean an international court of arbitration set up by the Permanent Court of Arbitration. The arbitration, the case actually began many, many years ago, and then it was paused by the World Bank, and then it sort of started again. There's a part of it that is settled. So the court's award was given a few months ago, but there's a part that's still pending. For example, the neutral expert has still to issue a determination. But the one thing that I want to, and there's so much happening in those awards in that arbitration. But the one thing that I want to talk about is that, when we talk about, for example, something like the everyday relationship with a river, or what a river means to whom, again, I just want to stress, and that's why one of the images I showed at the beginning was this one. I want to stress and sort of, emphasize and make us sort of constantly ask this question of what is natural, what is ecological, what is destructive, what is engineering, what is engineered versus, what is the prior that we are assuming when we say, oh, this is an engineered ecology. Of course it is. So in the latest arbitration rulings, one of the interesting elements is that one of the things that Pakistan was arguing for was in trying to control and constrain the kinds of hydropower plants that India can build on the western rivers of the Indus. This too is a category that is a political category. Pakistan made the case that the Court of Arbitration say that India has to follow the let flow principle for the western rivers. The court actually rules on this particular point that the let flow principle is not upheld by the treaty, by a simple reading of the treaty, a simple construction of letting the rivers flow, it doesn't follow. And I make this point to say that, to emphasize that there's a whole treaty, there's a whole legal infrastructure also, not just engineering, there's a whole legal infrastructure, it's architecture at play. And that determines very micro and minute things such as what flora and fauna survive, thrive, die, what fish species and to what extent will live and where, in which reaches of the river, etc., etc. Right? So again, just to stress the extent of how litigated and managed, how anthropogenically managed this ecology is. And in the book, I conceptualize it as an infrastructural ecology. And the point is not to give it another name. The point is not at all to like name and claim, but just to stress the continuous and like very tightly interlinked relation between human intervention, human design, and ecology in this in the Indus Basin. The last prompt was a very interesting one about what it would mean to take lived experiences seriously in shaping policy and action. And very quickly and briefly, and I'll say these, to
Maira, I'm sorry to interrupt. We're very short of time. You're fascinating because it's completely a unique take, but would you mind just wrapping up with final thoughts? I'm very sorry.
Not at all. Absolutely. I was going to take 30 more seconds and I'll take 15 more. So my 2 points there would be, one thing to do would be to open up the category of expertise and who counts as an expert. If we want policy making to be more inclusive, if we want policy making to be more expansive. And the second would be being clear about aims. For example, is it more crop per drop per some recent World Bank publications that Pakistan's water worlds are taking seriously? Or is it things like water security? And what does water security mean? Is it food security? What does that mean? I will end here. Thank you for your time, and I really look forward to Navida's presentation and then also the conversation.
Thank you, Maira. That really was just compelling. Thank you.
Thank you very much, really. Water is a very complex topic, and it can take forever, and rightfully so. So here, I think I'll just point one thing that Maira was mentioning, this dotted line. See, this dotted line was created really after 1947 between Pakistan and India. But there is a dotted line also within Pakistan. If you go and basically talk to the people in Punjab versus Sindh, even when the water comes into Pakistan, then there is a conflict. And that conflict is within Pakistan, not between Pakistan and India. And then she got bored really with Indus Water Treaty, and rightfully so for an anthropologist really who wants to read all this legal language. And I tried to delve into this as an engineer. I also find it extremely fascinating. There is a clause in basically in the International Court of Justice called reasonable and equitable distribution of water. And they don't keep it basically what reasonable means, what equitable means. And we have been fighting it forever now. And it has not stopped. What is reasonable for Pakistan may be different than for India. What is reasonable for Sindh may be very different for Punjab. So that's where basically the conflict comes in. So this is where now I think I'll basically hand it over to Navida. I think she has been thinking about this problem, and I asked her to do something else. I said, okay, now that you have thought about feeling and thinking, what can we actually do about this? So we had a very brief discussion about this. So I read a paper a few years ago. So this has looked at about 800 water projects in Bangladesh over the last 50 years. So the conclusion was, I think, is quite good. He said that from the conceptualization point of view, meaning from the planning, is phenomenal. See, Bangladesh has basically given right to water. It's basically, river is an entity in Bangladeshi constitution. So from planning is very good. Even at the project level is good. It does get basically when the World Bank sends money, Harsh sends money, $100 million to Bangladesh. Basically, it is very well done. And then we have followed basically some of our students are working in World Bank. At that level is very beautifully crafted. Now when it comes to the project level, it goes to Bangladesh Water Board. That is also not bad. I think they are trying to do some basically things that basically World Bank told us to do and they have agreed to do is perfectly fine. When you actually go to the field level, it totally disintegrates. Totally, even you will not find basically engineers, they're staying basically in Dhaka. They're not on the ground. They cannot even go to the ground because they are too worried basically because they are not doing anything on the ground, number one. Number two, that their children are going to school in Dhaka really. How could they go and live in Khulna? There is no school there. So this disconnect really, and Peter Rogers basically, he has a very astute observation. In Bangladesh and India, in water ministry or in water hierarchy, the chief engineer is the way you want to retire. But any chief engineer in Bangladesh or in India do not last more than 18 months because this is almost at the end of their career. But they want to tell their grandchildren that I was a chief engineer. Now, in 18 months, what can you do? So there is no basically continuity of really work going on. So that is where the doing parts comes in. So here, where I want to hear really from Navida really some astute observation really, how do you go now from this thinking and feeling stuff to doing?
Yes, I have 5 5 minutes, and I'm going to solve all the problems. Welcome, and thank you very much to Hitesh and to the Mittal Institute for this invite. It's wonderful to be here. I've already learned a tremendous amount just from hearing the commentaries and the conversations and introductions, much less the presentations. So my job is really, the first blush of it was to really give you a sense of where it is that I do field work in Bangladesh, because I think I'm representing the lower stream parts of the river. So far we've had somebody from India speak, somebody from Pakistan speak, so I have a sense that giving you a sense of what these rivers feel like at these lower reaches may be the most of what I can accomplish very quickly. So just to start, Bangladesh is, as you know, a very riparian society. At its last count, there was something like 900 rivers. Geographer Harun al-Rashid has written this very famous geography of Bangladesh, and his description, which I find very poetic, so I'll just quickly read it out. So we have in Bangladesh tiny mountain streams, winding seasonal creeks, muddy khals or canals, some truly magnificent rivers and their tributaries and distributaries. The waterways are so plentiful that they constitute a veritable maze. Altogether, their winding gives about 4,000 kilometers in length in a country that is merely the size of the state of Wisconsin. So you can imagine just how waterlogged this landscape is. The other interesting thing, and this is sort of like a little bit resonating with what Professor Eck was talking about, the names of the rivers. The names of the rivers here are, of course, of all different historical moments and events, but very often the names try to give you a sense of movement, right? So and it really, in some ways, taps into the imagination of how rivers are experienced in Bangladesh, which is in terms of whether they are speedy or slow. So you'll have the Tuareg River, which is a very fast-moving river, and then in Dhaka itself, in the old part of Dhaka, you've got the Buri Ganga, which is the old Ganga, and it's, you know, a pretty stagnant water body, quite polluted, as you can imagine at this point. So this is just to give you a sense of Bangladesh as a riparian landscape. Now, just sort of reaching into where I particularly work, which is the Jamuna River, which is the lower part of the Brahmaputra. What's interesting about this river, and it's something that hasn't come up in the descriptions of the rivers we've had, unlike meandering rivers, it's a braided river. So that means that it's not really, doesn't really have one final face. It's many, many fragments of it across the landscape. And so it gives a very different sort of a feel to a river than, you know, when you see sort of like a large winding river. And one of the aspects of what I was trying to study was trying to understand how it is that people who've never actually experienced living next to a river suddenly find themselves very close to a river. And how it is that they know what to do, having not actually ever experienced this sort of an event of, you know, large chunks of their land breaking away, because the river skitters, right, across the landscape, and so different people are constantly experiencing it. And so a large part of my book was talking about how it is that the river actually teaches people how to live with it. Just very recently, I was in conversation with Iftikhar Iqbal, who's a wonderful historian of rivers as well. And his new book, The Range of the River, really talks about the Tibetan basin and how the Tibetan plateau has sort of given rise to these very major rivers, and how it has been sort of the space of what he calls mobility, traffic of goods, people, animals, etc. And then, you know, it was an interesting juxtaposition to have him talk about this sort of like, you know, this very energetic river system and how it allowed for empire, but also didn't allow for empire, and so on. And when I moved to talking about my work, it was really just about mud and silt and chores and erosion. And so what we decided, how we would break down our conversation is, he's going to talk about mobility, and I would talk about movement, and particularly sort of displacement. And that is a key theme in my work, which is to show how it is that it isn't just the floods, which is the biggest imagination that we have of what Bangladesh's experiences with water is, it isn't just the floods, it's actually the continuity of erosion as part of an everyday life. How do you live with erosion that can happen either as a consequence of floods or just as a consequence of the fact that the soil on which you have your house and settlements are really very unstructured soil, right? So it has just this ability to be constantly moving. And so the main question for me was really actually, and this goes back to what Maira was also talking about, was not so much about rivers, but about what does it mean to live with moving land? Everything that we think about as very much part of the social, if you think about property, or you think about marriage and inheritance, etc., it's premised on land being there. But what happens when land isn't there, and you still have those same forms? You still sort of transact in land. You're buying and selling, etc. And some part of my book talks about what is a market in this sort of like lost land looks like. Because if you have a deed, you have land, basically. And you sell and buy deeds constantly of land that doesn't exist. And I can talk more about that if we have a chance, but I don't want to stay too long talking about my book. So one thing that I also realized in connection to Professor X's very wonderful sort of description of all the various rivers and how it is being used in the Indian context, and particularly the ritualized use of the river, and thinking about rivers as possibly cathedrals in the scope that they have in the Indian context, I realized that even though rivers are so important in the context of Bangladesh, obviously, for various reasons, it hasn't people don't have that same ritualized relationship to it. And this is something, really struck me, because those images, wonderful images of people with their hands raised in the river, is something I don't think I've ever seen in the 10 years I've been doing field work where I am. And so big question for me has been, was it ritualized ever? Obviously Hindus lived in these spots, and there are much fewer Hindus in the areas that I work in now. Is there a loss of ritualization? Does that loss of ritualization mean a different kind of a relationship to the river, one that's more pragmatic, more resource-oriented? Because I was thinking about one particular ritual that was very important historically in the area called Bera Bhashan, which is, you float, you create sort of boats out of banana leaves, and you put all sorts of offerings and votives and everything, and you float it on to put in remembrance of Khwaja Khijir, who's a very important figure in the Islamic tradition, as the prophet who is a fictional prophet who sort of oversees safe passage and trade, etc., and who's supposed to be sort of the equivalent of Ganga Devi in the sort of mythic imagination in this area. That ritual is gone. You only read about it in folklore books. There are shrines around the river where I work. There's Khwaja Yunus Ali's shrine, but what it gives rise to is medical colleges and hospitals and so on, right? So what is that relationship? What could a ritualized relationship to the river, actually not just thinking about infrastructure, but actually thinking about what would it take to re-ritualize a river, is something that really came to my mind as hearing Professor X speak. So anyway, for the next few minutes, I want to just take you through a few photographs to give you a visual image of the site, and then very quickly turn to the 3 prompts that I got from Shafiq, which were wonderful and also helped me think about beyond my book. If you don't mind, if I can have the next image. Here. So here's an image of me coming close to the land, the shore where I work, and you can't really tell where land begins and where water ends. So I want to give you a sense of just how it is that this is a mixed landscape where, my boat could actually run aground anywhere over here, in part because land starts actually over here already, because of the chore deposits. And so this is just to give you a sense of like what this sort of landscape feels like. May I have the second? So this is, one of the main means of transportation between the mainland as the sort of like the part that hasn't been, in some ways, chunked away from the main part of Bangladesh, and the island chores look like. And what's incredible about this is a boat that only really became an effective means of transportation when tractors started to come to Bangladesh, because they took the engines out of the tractors and affixed them to the boats, and suddenly rowboats became, these extremely fast-moving boats, right? And quite stable too. And what I also found amazing about these boats is that I realized that they weren't just obviously for transportation, but they were the ways in which news traveled. So, for example, if people knew that their village was under threat of being eroded, they would just start going on these boats very often, and in order to just spread the news that, our village is going to go under, where can we move our people to, and, make appeals to people to say, if you have any land that you're not using, can we come and take shelter in your land? And I just found it fascinating that this little boat, could be such a conduit for information and for creating connections and creating relations. Okay, so the next maybe? This is to give you a sense of just the constancy of erosion and the fact that, here you can see that barely a sliver of land stands between the river and the rest of town. Next. Sorry, someone else is doing it, and I keep... So this is a field that I had just walked on just 2 days ago, and then when I show up, it had some cracks in it, but this enormous thing had happened overnight. This is right in the middle of the island, in the middle of an agricultural field, and that I thought this image in some ways really gives you a sense of like how life just caves away in moments. And then the next final one, actually the last two. So this is, kids who are helping with bringing down the houses, the tin walls of the houses to transport somewhere else. I just love the picture of them just sort of like gaily going about this. In the hopes of getting what they call farm chicken at the end of all their efforts. And then the final, which is, really gives you a sense of what it is that a life in this area accrues, and how it is that people put everything together in this very careful way as they make the move from one area to another. And, these are people who might have moved, the older people have moved upward of 20 times in the course of their lives. Younger people less so, in part because of the Jamuna Bridge that was built in the 90s to connect. Okay, I see the hand. All right, so very, very quickly, I will just move to the 3 questions that I have from Shafiq. One was to talk about infrastructure. What is an infrastructure that, in some ways has yielded a lot, but also has borne negative repercussions? So as I was talking about the bridge was great in terms of connecting the northern part of Bangladesh to the rest of Bangladesh. However, it's also a bridge that slowed down, changed the nature of the river. And while it has made it possible for the people I work with to have sort of more stable ground to live on, it's also the fact that it's made the river much more erosive. Another infrastructure that we don't talk about enough, but that is actually a part of the story of the pollution of rivers, is the Green Revolution. The Green Revolution in Bangladesh happened in the face of tremendous food insecurity, even famines, but it has given rise to such copious use of pesticides and fertilizers that a lot of the fish population decline is because of that. So, so well-meaning acts, this is the second question. Well-meaning acts that really have not had as much consequence. So, I heard Shafiq tell you about the 2019 legal decision to give river rights. And this on paper sounds amazing. And it's not just merely a question of giving the guardian of the river, which is the National River Conservation Commission, more sort of strength. The concept of personhood is actually quite problematic, and it's one that we should think about a bit more. more, because personhood is the first thing that ever got personhood was the corporation, and so it really derives from an economic base. And colleagues of mine like Lisa Saraganian have written how granting such personhoods is a way of sort of averting the question of what other kinds of lateral solidarities can we express with the non-human world to which we lay claims, have relations, etc. So maybe I'll just stop at that and just offer that as a provocation to say that things that sound really wonderful may not be if we think about it. So what would it take for us to rethink our relationship to river? For instance, re-ritualizing, as I was saying earlier, as opposed to the granting of personhood. Okay, thank you very much. I'll just stop there.
All right, wonderful. So thank you very much, really. And as a closing thought, so what I would essentially tell three things. So rivers are just not to be managed. So as Navide was saying, that how do we reconceptualize or re-ritualize river? And that's, I think, is an important insight. And how do we do this is not clear, but I think we need to start thinking about this. And to do this, maybe this framework of thinking, feeling, and doing, and connecting them together, I think would be a way to go. So please think about those. Again, I use the first word, think. But when you are thinking, bring in feeling as well as doing. Just thinking is not enough. Then we just become scientists. If we just feel, then we become a humanist and not much. If we just become doing, then we become basically a reckless operational guy, which we do not want. So basically, in this case, I really bring an analogy between Lincoln and Godfather. So you need to think about, really, I want you to basically think, feel, and do like Lincoln, not like Godfather. Godfather is also very pragmatic. So not at that level. So with that, really, we will close this. And thank you very much, really, for your time and attention.